Welcome to Savvy Business, Life Unscripted, with your host, Christina Rivera, where our guests share their wisdom and valuable business tips, empowering our audience to expand their personal potential.
Hi, Donna Andersen. Welcome to Savvy Broadcasting, Life Unscripted. I'm so grateful to have you here this wonderful Saturday afternoon. We're going to touch on a subject that we've never really hit on Savvy Broadcasting, and that is what happens if you come across a sociopath and end up marrying one. You've written a book, Senior Sociopath, How to Recognize and Escape Lifelong Abusers. And this really can hit anyone at any age, but your book really hits on if you're an older person and you get with not good sociopaths. And what is that even? We're going to go into all of that, but I'd love for you to share a little bit about your backstory and what even prompted you to write your book.
Well, I married a sociopath. This guy turned out to be a complete con artist. He thought that we had this wonderful future together because we had so much in common on a business side, and he considered himself to be an entrepreneur. He actually told me that he was the next Walt Disney, and unfortunately, I believed him, but this was long before we knew about these predators who are all among us. But anyway, he took $250,000 from me. He cheated with at least 6 different women during our 2.5-year relationship. He had a child with one of those women. And then 10 days after I left him, not 10 days after we divorced, but 10 days after I left him, he married the mother of the child, which was the second time he committed bigamy. And this behavior, once I started finding out what was going on, my head was spinning. It made no sense to me. And I told my therapist about his outrageous betrayals. And she said, he sounds like a sociopath. And I'm like, sociopath? What's that? And my background was journalism and marketing communications. And when I realized what was going on, I realized that I had a story that needed to be told. So I launched my website, which is called lovefraud.com. And since then, I've written 8 books. This is the 8th book on the topic. And I just hope to alert people of these folks who are out there.
Yeah. Now, this is an actual clinical diagnosis. Now, you've heard people just kind of randomly put out, he's a psychopath or he's a sociopath. And I don't think people have an understanding what those words mean. Can you give an understanding what is a sociopath?
Okay. Well, actually now the word sociopath is no longer an official clinical diagnosis. It used to be, but it no longer is. Now, for that particular disorder, they use the term antisocial personality disorder.
Which doesn't sound as bad, actually.
Yeah. When the term was first introduced back in 1930, it originally meant anything deviated or pathological in social relations. So that's how I use the term on Love Fraud, because it turns out that there are multiple disorders in which the behaviors are similar. For example, I just mentioned antisocial personality disorder, but there's also narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, and psychopathy. And what these disorders have in common is that the people who have them exploit and manipulate those around them in order to get what they want. Now, for the point of view of the target, which is me and you and anybody else who gets hooked by one of these folks, the precise clinical diagnosis doesn't matter. We just need to know that they're out there and we need to avoid all of them. So that's why I use the word sociopath as it was originally intended, to talk about all of these folks in one category, because we need to know that there are people out there who simply do not think the same way that we do. They're motivated totally differently, and we need to be very careful about them.
Well, now that is totally wow. So how do you even begin to recognize if someone is a sociopath? And you mentioned the fact that they influence people probably in a not good manner, but how do you begin to recognize anyone around you who might be a sociopath or trying to manipulate you?
Well, they once you understand that they're out there, you can start to recognize them. They do seem to have a lot of traits in common. For example, many of them are charismatic and charming, which is kind of unfortunate because they seem to be, a lot of fun to be around. They all tend to lie, although unfortunately, we don't realize that they're lying until after the fact or when we're able to do some more exploration. They tend to need a lot of excitement. They also tend to be promiscuous, which we may come across in the business world. But a couple of signs that are that you will see that are kind of not as appealing, shall we say, is that they tend to blame other people for everything that goes wrong. They don't take responsibility for anything. And they engage in what we call the pity play. They try to make you feel sorry for them. Then, of course, there's aggression, there's hostility, which you may or may not see because they can keep it under wraps when necessary. But there's this whole group of traits that people need to be aware of. In fact, my second book was called Red Flags of Love Fraud, 10 Signs You're Dating a Sociopath. Whoa. And that's the one where I lay out exactly what the traits are to watch out for, at least as far as romantic relationships are concerned. Although the sociopaths tend to use the same strategies in business situations, they just modify it depending on who it is that they're trying to draw in.
Interesting. You mentioned something that they're charming. And I'd heard way back that charm is not something you're born with. It's something actually you put on like a suit. And the same thing goes for nice. People aren't really nice per se. It's a cloth you put on. And so to be aware if someone seems really charming, like I heard Ted Bundy was super charming, but a serial killer. So, charming, something you put on. What constitute someone who's trying to be charming? Is it something that's just being overly nice to you? And what does it look like?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure that I would agree with that. I think that there are definitely people who just have an inborn talent, for relationships and for being nice and for knowing how to draw people in. But at least in the term of these sociopaths and psychopaths, and Ted Bundy was certainly a psychopath, and yes, he fit all the criteria, and charm was one of them. They tend to be magnetic. They tend to be larger in life. When I met my ex-husband, I mean, he was this Superman. I thought I was meeting someone who was going to be the next Walt Disney, and they just have this confidence about them, and they just move forward, and you really kind of feel special when you're in their orbit. And, they kind of know this and they use it to manipulate people. But they often tend to be or seem to be larger than life.
Some of those traits sound like if you use them for good could be awesome and you can make great change in the world. It depends on how you're using it. Like all things, it could be used for evil or good. And if you use some of those traits, like if you're, know how to connect with people and draw them in, have a great vision, you can create great things in the world, or you can create really havoc and mess.
That's true. In fact, there's a man by the name of Dr. Robert Hare, who is a psychologist, and he developed an instrument, which is essentially a test. It's how they evaluate psychopaths. And it's called the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, very interesting title. But anyway, his definition of a psychopath is more narrow than the definition used by the clinicians for antisocial personality disorder. These two disorders are very similar, but not precisely the same. And Dr. Hare anticipates that about 1% of the general population would meet his definition of a psychopath. However, he also tested corporate executives, and he found that 3.5% of corporate executives meet the definition of a psychopath. So that means there's 3.5 times more psychopaths in the corner office than there is on the street.
Now, maybe though, some of those traits in a positive matter actually are probably needed for that environment, perhaps, but it's not good in a love environment. But maybe in that context, it works well.
Well, not necessarily. Think Bernie Madoff.
Oh.
I mean, he's a classic. Or you think of the guys who were running Enron or WorldCom. I mean, there was a lot of speculation that these folks were psychopaths. In fact, there's one study that came out a few years ago when they were talking about the 2008 financial crisis. And this researcher believes that the crisis was caused by psychopaths in the financial industry messing around with other people's money.
All right, that's not positive. Definitely not. But let's say some of our listeners are older and have started in the dating market. Some people, a lot of, like I said before our interview, a lot of these savvy business owners are business owners who've started later in life. They had other careers, vocations, kids went off to college, maybe they had a life-threatening illness and they decided, second chapter, I'm starting a business. Now, and same goes for dating. Sometimes you've become divorced, your significant other has passed on, and you start to enter the dating world. What does someone listening in have to pay attention to as far as signs looking for a dating partner or significant other as far as not get hooked up with a psychopath?
Well, what I started to say, as far as, they tend to be charming, they tend to engage in something called love bombing. And what that means is that they shower you with attention and affection. They want to be with you all the time. They think you're wonderful and they're planning dates 6 months in advance. And, it's just really over the top. They also engage in this phenomenon that I call the sudden soulmate. What that means is that when you meet this person, you feel like you've met the person you've been waiting for all your life, and you just seem to have so much in common. Well, there's a reason for that. And the reason is that the sociopath studies you, figures out what it is that you're looking for, and then makes himself or herself into that person. You also tend to see this Jekyll and Hyde personality. One minute they love you, the next minute they hate you, and you can't figure out what happened in between. And, so there are these signs. So what I would say is that people need to educate themselves. It's actually a 3-step process to protect yourself. The first is to know that they exist. And this is actually the hardest part. I can't tell you how many times people have said to me, I never knew people like this existed. Well, they do. And we need to educate ourselves about that. The second is to know the warning signs. And I just went through a few of those. But the third is to trust your intuition. We all have instincts. We all have intuition. And intuition is like baked into the human existence, specifically to protect us from predators. So if you get a gut feeling, or the hair is going up on the back of your neck, or something like that, pay attention, because it probably is your intuition warning you of danger.
Wow. You hit on so many positive, good tips for people to pay attention to. Over the top. I've dated people like that early in my dating life. And it's like, it's so overwhelming. It's like flowers, this and da-da. It's like, slow down. And the fact that you're being studied and why it seems too good to be true. Well, you'll get this feeling inside like, this seems a little too good to be true. And that is one of the warning signs, like your instincts are trying to tell you, hey, wait up. Everything is just too perfect here. Let's just examine this. And I think often you mentioned early that, most people don't think like this. So we assume everyone out there thinks like we do. Like if someone does something horrible, you can't imagine why they do that, because you wouldn't do something horrible like that, like kill someone or, whatever. So trust your instincts when something deep inside of you is saying something's not right here.
That's so critical. And, this is actually gets to the root of the problem. The fact is that there are millions of sociopaths living among us. Depending on which study you look at, the estimates range from 5.5% to 17.5% of the population could have one of those disorders that they're called cluster B personality disorders by the clinicians. And so what that means, if we take a midpoint of about 12%, if 12% of adults in the United States have one of these cluster B personality disorders, that means we live among 31 million sociopaths. Okay. And they're everywhere. They're just absolutely everywhere. And all cities and states, all demographic groups, all professions. I've heard, in fact, in the research that I do, one of the questions that I've asked frequently was, did the person you knew who you believe was a sociopath ever falsely claim to be these certain roles? And the biggest one is, religious or clergy. Like 20% of people said that the person they knew was falsely claiming to be spiritual, born again, or even a member of the clergy. So they take on these roles specifically in order to impress people.
So do they take on certain authoritarian roles that people feel comfortable with?
Yeah, well, the next one is, military and law enforcement, or special forces. My ex claimed, that he was a Vietnam veteran in special forces. He was never in the military. He actually joined the local Vietnam Veterans Association. He was a keynote speaker at a Veterans Day parade and was never in the military.
Wow. Well, now I'm curious. Having written all your books and worked with a lot of people, and we're trying to wake people up to notice this and first become aware, is there anything maybe a parent can do if they start to see these exhibit signs in their children? Can we try to thwart it? Or maybe is someone listening and going, hey, I think I might be a sociopath. Can you get away from that? Is there a way to, or?
Okay, well, a couple things. As far as someone who wonders about whether they themselves are a sociopath, if that worries them, they're not a sociopath. Because real sociopaths do not worry about how their behavior affects others. Now, as far as parents with children, that can be an issue. In fact, I've spoken to plenty of people who realize that they've been involved with a sociopath and had children with this person, and then the child starts to exhibit these signs. So if you can start working with a child very young, there is an opportunity to make it so that they don't become disordered, maybe, because these conditions are highly genetic. And so what that means is that a child can be born with a predisposition to these disorders. And then depending on the environment that they grow up in and the parenting that they receive, that will influence whether or not the disorders actually come to fruition. So if you can start working with someone like Babe in Arms, then you may have a shot at it. But once somebody becomes an adult, once they're in their 20s, there's really no therapy that has proven to cure any of these disorders.
Wow. So it seems like this disorder, as you were saying, is genetic. It comes from, it's ingrained in you. It's not like it was something that it's a learned behavior that's nurtured into you. It's more genetic basis.
There's definitely a genetic foundation. Now, it may be possible, with the right kind of parenting. And this is actually really new information. This has only come out in the past few years, that you may be able to influence it, because essentially what happens is these children are not born with the ability to love. Okay. It doesn't come natural to them. They're very independent. They don't seem to need their mothers. They don't seem to need people. So essentially what happens is that they need to be taught how to love. They need to be taught how to value close relationships with people. And it may be possible if you start young enough to do that. But there are some cases in which it's what they call the genetic insult. The genetics are so strong that they can't be overcome, because I've spoken to, plenty of parents who did everything, did everything they could, took them to therapy, did all the unconditional love and everything like that. And it made no difference. So, I mean, that is a possibility as well.
And mostly the sociopaths that we're talking about, do most of them end up in a life of crime, or is it kind of just they manipulate people, but it doesn't really turn into a criminal life? Or what have you found?
Not not necessarily a life of crime. In fact, in this most recent book, Senior Sociopaths, that was one of the things that I asked about. Now, in this particular book, the way I put it together was that I surveyed my Love Fraud readers, specifically about people who they believed were sociopathic and were age 50 or older. I mean, that's who we talked about. And the reason that I did this is because there is this prevailing view in the mental health field that sociopaths burn out in their 40s and stop engaging in an antisocial behavior. Well, this made no sense to me because my ex-husband was older than that when I met him. You know, he was not embezzling, he was manipulating me and exploiting me. And he continued to do it after I divorced him. So there were victims before me, there were victims after me. So I was also hearing the same thing from my readers. It was like, you know, I was hearing from all these people who were involved with folks who were 40, 50, 60, 70 years old and still doing it. So my goal was to document that this does happen and that they do not burn out. And that's what I was able to do. In fact, I had more than 2,100 people filled out the initial survey, and about 40% of them knew the individuals both before and after the age of 50. And I asked, you know, what happened to their behavior before and after 50? 91% said their deceit, manipulation, or antisocial behavior was just as bad or worse as they aged. So, you know, these people do not change. They do not get better. And this is the main message. I mean, folks need to know that, because I hear from people who stayed in marriages, for example, for 20 and 30, 40 years, hoping and praying for change. It's not going to happen.
No.
So people need to understand this, so that if you come to the conclusion that you're dealing with someone who has a serious personality disorder, and you can do that, they don't necessarily have to be diagnosed by a professional. You need to understand that they're not going to change, and you need to factor that into your decisions for your own life as you move forward.
Yeah, really good points, because, you know, we've heard long ago a woman will marry someone and say, oh, I'm going to change them. Well, you can't change anyone who doesn't want to be changed, regardless of psychopath or otherwise. But, you know, and it makes sense. If it's genetic, why would it just switch off at 40? It doesn't make sense. It's ingrained in the person. But I'm so glad you were able to come chat on this. Really, hopefully open the eyes or begin to make people want to go deeper. Get a copy of your book at lovefraud.com, Senior Sociopath, How to Recognize and Escape Lifelong Abusers, to really get privy. Are anyone in your life, whether you're dating them or just, you know, maybe business partners or someone, a client, whatever it might be, just to become aware that these people exist and to educate yourself. I really thank you, Donna Andersen, for coming to Savvy Broadcasting today. Is there anything you'd like to leave with our audience before we leave?
Well, you know, a lot of people get into these situations and it can be very devastating. And I'd like to say that you can recover from it. In fact, about a year and a half after I divorced my sociopathic ex, I met another man, and we've been happily married for 17 years. So it can be overcome.
Yay! I love that. Thank you so much, Donna Andersen, for coming to Savvy Broadcasting today.
Thank you.
Like, subscribe, and share this episode. To listen to more Savvy episodes and Savvy Biz Tips, go to www.lifeunscriptedradio.com. To find out about our paid sponsorship opportunities or how to become a guest, email Christina at lifeunscriptedradio.com.